Out on the raw edge of Wyoming, where the wind howls secrets across the plains and the fences run on till they just give up, there was a man named Harlan Pike. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't a villain. He was just a ghost haunting his own life. He had a scar on his shoulder from a long-forgotten fight, a stove that coughed smoke on cold nights, and a porch swing that hadn't swung in 7 years. Not since Miriam, his wife, went into the bedroom to bring a new life into the world and never came back out. The life she was carrying didn't either. Folks in the nearest town, which was more a rumor than a place, said Harlan had gone strange, said he talked to the wind, said his silence was a sickness. But the truth was simpler. Harlan had emptied himself of words, of feelings, of everything but the ache of breathing. His heart was a locked room, and he'd long ago thrown away the key. And he figured that's how he'd die, alone, quiet, and forgotten. But one morning when the frost clung to the world like a shroud, something appeared at the edge of his property. It wasn't a wolf. It wasn't a lost cow. It was a boy, no older than 9, with ribs you could count and eyes like old river stones, too tired to even be scared. He was curled up by the barn, his fingers blue, clutching two things like they were the last treasures on earth, a hawk's feather and a smooth gray stone. He hadn't come to steal. He hadn't come to beg. He looked like he'd come to find a quiet place to let go. And Harlan, the man who hadn't opened his door to another soul in 7 years, did something that shocked even himself. He knelt down, scooped the boy into his arms. He weighed nothing, less than nothing, and carried him inside. He stoked the fire. He ladled stew into a bowl. He wrapped the child in Miriam's old quilt. And he waited. He didn't ask a name, didn't ask where he came from. He just sat in the heavy silence, a silence that felt different now. Not empty, but waiting. 2 hours crawled by. Then the boy's voice, a dry crackle like autumn leaves. He didn't ask for more food. He didn't ask where he was. He just looked at Harlan with those ancient eyes and whispered 3 words that chilled the rancher to the bone. You found me. Not you saved me. Not thank you. But you found me. As if he'd been waiting. As if Harlan was the one who was lost. And what Harlan couldn't possibly know, as he stared into that child's face, was that this single act of kindness wasn't an ending. It was the pulling of a thread that would unravel not just his life, but the entire history of that bloody, forgotten land. Because the boy wasn't just a boy, and he hadn't arrived by accident. He was a message, and the people who sent him were coming. The boy slept for a day and a half, a deep, bottomless sleep that scared Harlan more than once. He'd press his ear to the child's chest just to hear the faint, fluttering beat. In those long hours, Harlan saw things he hadn't let himself see in years. He saw the intricate beadwork on the boy's worn-out moccasins. He saw a faint, almost invisible scar shaped like a star on the boy's wrist. And he saw something else. Tucked into the boy's waistband was a small, leather-wrapped object. Harlan knew he shouldn't look. It was a violation of something. But the silence of the house was screaming at him. With trembling fingers, he gently pulled it free. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't a toy. It was a lock of hair, thick, wavy, and the exact shade of honey blonde as his Miriam's. A cold dread, sharp and suffocating, seized Harlan's chest. It was impossible. Miriam had been gone for 7 years. She'd had no family he knew of, no connection to any of the local tribes. He'd buried her himself on the hill behind the house, right where she'd loved to watch the sunset. He looked from the lock of hair to the sleeping boy. His skin was the color of rich earth, his hair as black as a raven's wing. There was no sense to it. None. It had to be a coincidence. It had to be. He shoved the leather pouch back into the boy's waistband just as the child's eyes flickered open. They weren't sleepy or confused. They were sharp, aware, and they were staring right at Harlan's hand. The boy didn't say anything. He just watched Harlan, his gaze holding an unnerving weight of knowledge. It felt like an accusation. You hungry? Harlan asked, his voice rougher than he intended. The boy gave a slow, deliberate nod. He ate the bread and jerky Harlan offered, his movements efficient and quiet. He moved like a shadow, someone used to taking up as little space as possible. They didn't speak. The lock of hair was a silent scream between them. That night a storm rolled in. A real Wyoming monster that shook the little ranch house to its bones. Harlan lay awake, listening to the wind and the thunder, but the real storm was inside his head. Miriam's hair. A native boy. You found me. It was a puzzle with pieces that shouldn't fit, yet here they were. Around midnight, a floorboard creaked in the main room. Harlan grabbed the old shotgun he kept by his bed and slipped out into the hall. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long, dancing shadows. The boy was standing by the hearth, but he wasn't looking at the fire. He was looking at the mantelpiece, at the one picture of Miriam that Harlan kept. A small, faded tintype of her smiling, her eyes full of the light Harlan had tried so hard to forget. The boy reached up a small, hesitant hand, and he traced the line of her jaw in the picture. Then he whispered a single word into the darkness, a word in a language Harlan had never heard before. But the sound of it, the grief packed into that one little word, was universal. It sounded like mother. Harlan's blood turned to ice. This wasn't a coincidence. This wasn't a mistake. This child, this stranger, was connected to his dead wife. And Harlan realized with a sickening certainty that he had been living a lie for 7 years. The story of Miriam's death, the one he told himself every single day, wasn't the whole story. And this boy knew the rest of it. The next morning, the air was different. The storm had passed, leaving the world scrubbed clean and dangerously quiet. The boy was already up, feeding the chickens with a focus that was unnerving. He didn't speak of the night before, and neither did Harlan. The question of Miriam hung between them, fragile as a spider's web. To touch it felt like it would break everything. Harlan decided to ride the fence line. He needed space. He needed the wind to clear his head. He gave the boy a simple task, scrubbing the porch, and rode out. The image of the boy's finger tracing Miriam's face burned into his mind. How? How could Miriam, a woman from out east, have a native son? Had she lived a double life? Had she lied to him? The questions were a poison, twisting the memory of her into something ugly and unrecognizable. He was a mile from the house when he saw it, a glint of sunlight off something metal, high on the ridge that overlooked his valley. He pulled his horse to a stop, his hand instinctively going to the rifle in his scabbard. He squinted. It was a man watching his ranch through a spyglass. Harlan's heart hammered against his ribs. It wasn't unheard of for drifters or outlaws to scout a place, but this felt different. This felt connected. He turned his horse around and rode back, not at a gallop, but at a steady, deliberate pace. He wouldn't show fear. When he got to the ranch, the boy was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, stabbed at him. The porch was half scrubbed. A bucket of soapy water sat abandoned. "Kid!" Harlan yelled, his voice swallowed by the vast emptiness. No answer. He checked the barn, the bunkhouse, the root cellar. Nothing. The boy had vanished as silently as he'd appeared. Had he run away? Or had the man on the ridge? Then Harlan saw the tracks, small, barefoot prints leading away from the house. Not toward the road, but toward the hills, toward the jagged, unforgiving wilderness where a boy alone wouldn't last a day. And beside the boy's tracks was another set. A man's boots, heavy, worn down at the heel. Someone had taken him. Harlan didn't even think. He grabbed his rifle, a canteen of water, and a length of rope. His mind was a blizzard of fear and rage. Fear for the boy, and a white-hot rage at the faceless man on the ridge. But as he knelt by the tracks, he saw something that stopped him cold. The boy hadn't been dragged. There were no scuff marks, no signs of a struggle. He had walked away willingly. He had gone with the man. Why? Why would he leave the first safe place he'd known? Harlan followed the tracks for an hour, his gut twisting with every step. They led him up into the rocky terrain, to a place he rarely went, a small, hidden canyon with a narrow entrance. As he neared, he heard voices. He crept forward, his rifle ready, and peered around a large boulder. What he saw made no sense. The boy was there, standing beside a tall, grim-faced man, dressed in dusty trail clothes. The man wasn't native, he was white, and he was handing the boy a piece of hardtack. The boy took it, ate it, and then looked back toward the ranch. "He'll follow," the boy said, his voice clear and much older than it had sounded before. "He has to," the man grunted. "You sure he's the one? He just looks like a broken-down rancher." "He is," the boy insisted. "He has her eyes when he's not paying attention. He has the same sadness." The boy paused, then looked directly at the man. "Did you bring it?" The man reached into his saddlebag and pulled out an object wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it carefully. It was a pistol, an expensive, silver-inlaid Colt Peacemaker. But that wasn't what made Harlan's breath catch in his throat. Carved into the ivory grip was a single, elegant letter, M. It was Miriam's. A gift from her father, she told him. It had been buried with her. Harlan had put it in the casket himself. He felt the world tilt on its axis. His wife's gun, a gun that should be 6 feet under the ground, was here in the hands of a stranger, being shown to a boy who claimed her as his mother. "He needs to see this," the boy said. "Then he'll remember." Remember what? What in God's name had he forgotten? Harlan felt a wave of dizziness. A memory flickered at the edge of his mind, dark and violent. The night Miriam died, the storm, the shouting. It wasn't just the pain of childbirth he heard in his memory. It was another voice, a man's voice, angry and demanding. The man with the gun looked up, his eyes scanning the canyon walls as if he sensed he was being watched. He handed the pistol to the boy. "It's time," the man said. "Lead him to the next marker. If he makes it that far, maybe you're right about him." Lead him? A marker? This wasn't a kidnapping. It was a test, a trial, and Harlan was the subject. He backed away slowly, his mind reeling. Who was this man? And what did they want from him? He looked down at his own hands, at the calluses and scars. They felt like a stranger's hands. He had lived for 7 years in a fog of grief, but now the fog was beginning to clear, and he was terrified of what he might see. The ground beneath his feet wasn't just dirt and rock anymore. It was a lie. His whole life was a lie. And the truth was waiting for him out there in the wilderness, following a trail laid by a ghost and a child who shouldn't exist. Harlan didn't go back to the ranch. There was nothing for him there but questions. He was part of their game now, whether he wanted to be or not. He followed them from a distance, a ghost trailing ghosts. They moved with a purpose that baffled him, not in a straight line, but in a zigzag pattern across the territory, as if they were traveling between invisible points on a map. For 2 days he tracked them. He ate jerky from his saddlebags and drank sparingly from his canteen. The grief that had been his constant companion for 7 years was burned away by a raw, nervy adrenaline. His senses felt sharper than they had in years. He noticed the turn of a leaf, the crack of a twig. It was like waking from a long, terrible sleep. On the second night, he watched them make camp in a small sheltered grove. The man whose name he'd heard the boy say was Jonas sat by the fire, cleaning Miriam's pistol with an almost religious reverence. The boy, who Jonas called Tate, sat staring into the flames. "He's still following," Tate said, not looking up. Jonas nodded. "He's stubborn. I'll give him that. Your mother said he was." My mother. The words hit Harlan like a physical blow. Jonas had known Miriam. He'd known her well enough to talk about her, to carry her pistol. Was he a former lover? A brother Harlan never knew about? The possibilities were a swarm of angry bees in his head. She said the grief would either break him or forge him into the man he was supposed to be. Tate continued, his voice eerily calm. "We'll know soon which it is." Harlan pressed himself flat against the cold ground, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm. This was about him. It had always been about him. Miriam hadn't just died. She had set something in motion. A plan. A terrible, intricate plan that was only now coming to fruition, with his own son as a pawn. No, not his son. Her son. The next morning they reached what Tate had called a marker. It was an ancient, gnarled cottonwood tree, split down the middle by a lightning strike years ago. Jonas reached into a hollow in the trunk and pulled out another oilcloth package. This one was heavier. He unwrapped it and laid the contents on the ground. A stained and faded leather journal, a sheriff's badge tarnished with age, and a folded, yellowed piece of paper. "This is the last of it," Jonas said to Tate. Everything depends on what he does now. He left the items at the base of the tree, and then he and Tate mounted their horses and rode off, disappearing over the next rise. They didn't even look back. They knew Harlan was watching. They were leaving it for him. Harlan waited for a full hour, scanning the horizon, every nerve screaming. This had to be a trap, but the silence was absolute. Finally, he couldn't stand it any longer. He walked slowly toward the tree, his rifle held tight against his chest. He knelt. The sheriff's badge was from Carbon County, 200 miles south. He didn't recognize it. He opened the journal. The handwriting was neat, precise. It was a log of some kind. Dates, names, payments. It looked like a ledger. Then he unfolded the paper. It was a deed. A land deed for 1,000 acres of prime territory. Territory, his ranch. But the name on the deed wasn't Harlan Pike. It was signed and dated 10 years ago, and the owner of the land was listed as Burke Caldwell. Burke Caldwell, the banker from town, the cruel, sneering man who held the mortgage on nearly every property in the county. The man who Harlan had gone to, begging for an extension, just a month after Miriam died. Caldwell had looked at him with cold, dead eyes and said, "Tragedy is no excuse for poor planning, Mr. Pike." Harlan stared at the deed, his mind refusing to process what he was seeing. He'd bought this land fair and square. He had the paperwork locked in a box back at the ranch, his own deed, unless his deed was a fake. He flipped through the journal again, his hands shaking now. He started to recognize names, local ranchers, men he knew. Next to their names were numbers and the word foreclosure. But there were other words too: pressure, intimidation, burnout. This wasn't a ledger. It was a record of crimes, a meticulous account of how Burke Caldwell had systematically stolen land across the entire territory. And then he saw her name, Miriam Pike. Next to it, there wasn't a number. There was just one entry, dated the day she died. The handwriting was shakier here, as if written in a hurry. M. Pike discovered the exchange. Knows about the original survey maps. She has the proof. She won't listen to reason. Met with her at the ranch. She refused to cooperate. Situation resolved. Pike is a non-issue. He thinks it was the childbirth. The world dissolved into a meaningless roar. It wasn't grief that had taken her. It wasn't a medical complication. It was murder. Burke Caldwell had murdered his wife. The memory that had been flickering at the edge of his consciousness exploded into full, horrifying color. The storm. Caldwell at his door, his face slick with rain. "Just a friendly visit, Harlan. Your wife and I have some business to discuss." Harlan, trusting, naive, had gone to the barn to check on a spooked horse. He'd heard them arguing. He'd heard Miriam scream. He'd run back to the house, and Caldwell had met him on the porch. There was a struggle, a flash of pain as something struck his shoulder, Caldwell's pistol butt. He'd woken up on the floor, Caldwell gone, and Miriam. Miriam was silent in the bedroom. He had blamed himself. He had thought the trauma of seeing her gone had scrambled his memory of the night. But it wasn't scrambled. It was buried. Buried under 7 years of guilt and a lie planted by a monster. And Jonas and Tate, they knew. They had known all along. This entire journey, this bizarre test, was designed to make him remember, to force him to face the truth he'd been too broken to see. A new feeling, hotter and more powerful than grief, surged through Harlan. It was rage, pure, clarifying rage. He looked up from the deed, his eyes no longer full of sadness, but of fire. He knew what he had to do. This wasn't just about his land anymore. It wasn't just about Miriam. It was about justice. But what he didn't know was that the truth was even darker than he imagined. Because Burke Caldwell hadn't acted alone. And the journal in his hands was a death warrant for half the men in town. The man who had been the sheriff back then, a man named Hunt, his name was all over that book. The same Sheriff Hunt who was still in charge. The law in this territory wasn't broken. It was the weapon. Harlan stood up. He was no longer a victim. He was a hunter, and he was going back to town. He was going to burn it all down. Harlan rode not like a man, but like a storm front. He didn't feel the ache in his bones or the gnawing hunger in his belly. He was fueled by a cold, righteous fury that had been simmering for 7 years. The world that had once been gray and washed out was now stark and clear. There were no shades, only black and white. Good and evil. Miriam and Caldwell. He didn't go straight to town. That would be suicide. Caldwell and Sheriff Hunt owned the place, from the saloon to the jailhouse. To walk in unprepared would be to walk into his own grave. He needed a plan. He needed allies. But who? The other ranchers were either in Caldwell's pocket or too scared to act. That's when he thought of the one person who had nothing to lose. A man who hated Caldwell with a passion that rivaled his own. An old prospector named Silas who lived in the hills, driven off his claim by one of Caldwell's legal tricks years ago. People called him crazy. Harlan now suspected he was just ahead of the curve. He found Silas's camp tucked away in a hidden valley, a plume of smoke giving away his location. The old man met him with a shotgun leveled at his chest. "Pike," Silas spat, his eyes narrowed. "Thought you'd drunk yourself to death by now." "Not yet," Harlan said, holding up his hands. "I need to talk to you, Silas. It's about Caldwell." He laid it all out. The boy, the gun, the journal. Silas listened, his expression shifting from suspicion to disbelief, and finally to a grim understanding. When Harlan finished, Silas lowered the shotgun. "I knew it," the old man whispered, his voice trembling with vindicated anger. "I told everyone he was a damn thief, a snake. They all called me crazy." He looked at Harlan, his eyes boring into him. "So what now, Pike? What's your plan? You gonna march in there and get yourself shot?" "The journal is the key," Harlan said, his voice steady. "It implicates Hunt, the deputies, half the town council. But it's my word against theirs. We need more." "More what? An army?" The word hung in the air. An army. Harlan thought of the boy, Tate, and he thought of what Jonas had said. She said the grief would either break him or forge him into the man he was supposed to be. This was bigger than just him. It was bigger than Miriam. It was about the whole territory. And then he remembered something else. The star-shaped scar on Tate's wrist. He'd seen a similar mark before. Years ago, Miriam had been tending to a sick woman from the Ute tribe who lived in the high mountains. A small, peaceful band that kept to themselves. The woman had the same scar on her wrist. A clan marking. Tate wasn't just some random native boy. He was Ute. Miriam had connections to them. A deep connection, if she'd had a child with one of them. Harlan's heart clenched. He had been so lost in his own pain, he'd never even considered Miriam's life before him. But now a wild, desperate idea began to form. What if Jonas wasn't Tate's father? What if he was just a guardian? What if Miriam had entrusted her son to the Ute people for protection? Protection from Caldwell. And what if Jonas and Tate hadn't been testing Harlan for their own reasons, but for the tribe's? "Not an army, Silas," Harlan said, his mind racing. "A reckoning." He knew where he had to go. Not to town, not yet. He had to find Jonas and Tate. But more than that, he had to find the Ute. He had to present them with the journal, with the truth of what had happened to one of their own. Or at least one they had sheltered. But as he and Silas prepared to leave, a rider appeared on the horizon, moving fast. It wasn't Jonas. It was one of the local ranch hands, a kid named Billy. He rode into the camp, his horse lathered, his eyes wide with panic. "Mr. Pike, you gotta come quick," he gasped. "It's the town. Sheriff Hunt and a posse. They rode out to your ranch. They're tearing it apart, looking for you." Harlan's blood ran cold. "How did they know?" "Word got out you were seen in the hills," Billy said breathlessly. "And that ain't the worst of it. They got the boy." Harlan froze. "What boy?" "The little Injun boy. He showed up at your ranch this morning, alone. Said he was waiting for you. Hunt's men grabbed him. They're taking him back to town. They're saying he was part of that raid in the next valley. They're gonna hang him, Mr. Pike. They're gonna make an example of him." It was a trap. A brilliant, vicious trap. Caldwell and Hunt knew he wouldn't let the boy die. They were using Tate as bait to draw him into town, into their stronghold, where they could kill him quietly and call it justice. He looked at Silas, whose face had gone pale. He looked at the journal in his hands. He had the proof, but it was worthless if he was dead and the boy was hanging from a rope. All his planning, all his careful strategy, it was gone, burned away in an instant. He had no choice. He had to go to town. He had to walk into the lion's den. But he wouldn't be walking in alone. He looked at Silas. "Get your dynamite," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "And find every man Caldwell ever cheated. Tell them Harlan Pike is writing for justice. Tell them it's time to collect their debts." Silas grinned, a feral, wolfish thing. With pleasure, Harlan mounted his horse. He was no longer just a grieving husband. He was no longer just an angry victim. He was something else now, something forged. As he rode toward the town where his wife was murdered and a boy was about to be sacrificed, he finally understood. Miriam hadn't left him a legacy of grief. She had left him a war, and he was finally ready to fight it. The town was a hornet's nest. Sheriff Hunt had deputized a dozen of Caldwell's thugs, rough men who were more loyal to the banker's coin than any law. They patrolled the single dusty street, rifles in hand, their faces a mixture of arrogance and cheap whiskey. They had Tate locked in the sheriff's office, a small brick building that served as the town's fortress. Harlan didn't ride in the front. He was no fool. He met up with Silas and a small, determined group of 5 other ranchers on a ridge overlooking the town as dusk began to bleed across the sky. These were men who had lost everything to Caldwell: their land, their savings, their pride. Their eyes held the quiet desperation of men with nothing left to lose. "They're expecting you to come and shootin'," Silas whispered, handing Harlan a bundle of dynamite. "They're not expecting us." The plan was simple, desperate, but simple. Silas and 2 men would create a diversion at the far end of town, setting a fire at the livery stable. While Hunt and his men were distracted, Harlan and the others would hit the sheriff's office, get the boy, and get the hell out. And Harlan had an ace up his sleeve: the journal. But he wasn't going to hand it over. He was going to use it. He had spent the ride to town tearing out specific pages, the ones that implicated the men he knew were on patrol. As darkness fell, a flicker of orange appeared at the edge of town, quickly growing into a hungry roar. The livery stable was going up in flames. Shouts echoed through the street. Just as Silas predicted, Hunt and half his men jumped on their horses and galloped toward the fire. "Now!" Harlan hissed. They moved like wraiths, sticking to the shadows, their boots silent in the dust. They reached the alley beside the sheriff's office. Only 2 guards were left out front. Harlan stepped out of the darkness. "Evening, boy," he said calmly. The 2 deputies spun around, their rifles coming up. "Pike, don't move!" "I just want to talk," Harlan said, holding his hands up. In one hand, he held a piece of paper. "This is for you, Jeb. It's the page from Caldwell's little book, the one that describes how you helped him burn out the Miller farm. I believe the penalty for that is hanging." Jeb's face went white as a sheet. The other deputy, a young kid named Evan, looked confused. "And Evan," Harlan continued, pulling out another page, "this one's for you. All about that shipment of stolen Army rifles you helped fence for the sheriff. I'm sure the U.S. Marshals would love to read it." The 2 men looked at each other, then at Harlan. They were trapped. "What do you want, Pike?" Jeb stammered. "Walk away," Harlan said, his voice like flint. "Just turn around, walk away, and forget you ever saw me. The original pages are safe. If I live, you live. If I die, these get sent to the territorial governor." For a long second, nobody moved. Then Jeb slowly lowered his rifle. He dropped it in the dust and walked away without a word. Evan hesitated, then did the same, scurrying off into the darkness like a rat. Harlan and his men stormed the office. Inside, Tate was in a small cell, his face bruised but his eyes defiant. Behind the desk was the last deputy, a fat, wheezing man who fumbled for his pistol. One of Harlan's men knocked him out with a single punch. They shattered the lock on the cell and pulled Tate out. "Are you hurt?" Harlan asked. Tate shook his head. "Jonas is coming," he said, his voice urgent. "He went for the people." Before Harlan could ask what he meant, the front door burst open. It was Burke Caldwell, his face purple with rage, a shotgun in his hands. Behind him stood Sheriff Hunt, his own pistol drawn. They had been in the back room waiting. "It's over, Pike," Caldwell snarled. "You should have stayed a ghost." This is for Miriam, Harlan said, raising his own rifle. The office exploded in a chaos of noise and smoke. Harlan dove to the side, firing as he fell. One of his ranchers went down, clutching his chest. Caldwell's shotgun blast tore a chunk out of the wall where Harlan's head had been. It was a stalemate, a deadly close-quarters trap. Harlan was pinned behind the desk with Tate, the others trapped in the corner. "Give it up, Pike!" Hunt yelled over the ringing in their ears. "There's no way out." And then they heard it, a sound that started as a low rumble and grew into the thunder of 1,000 hooves, a sound that shook the very foundations of the building. But it wasn't a stampede. It was controlled, rhythmic. And then came the cry, a high, piercing war cry that cut through the night and chilled the blood of every man in that room. Caldwell's face, already pale, lost all its color. "What in God's name is that?" Tate looked at Harlan, and for the first time the boy smiled. A fierce, proud smile. "The people," he said. From the windows they could see them. Warriors, hundreds of them, pouring into the town from all sides. Ute warriors, their faces painted for war, armed with rifles and bows. They moved with a silent, deadly efficiency, surrounding the sheriff's office, their presence a suffocating wave of imminent violence. At their head rode a tall, imposing figure. It was Jonas. But he wasn't dressed as a dusty trail hand anymore. He wore the deerskin and eagle feathers of a Ute war chief. The game was over. The trap had been sprung, but not on Harlan. It had been sprung on Caldwell and Hunt. Sheriff Hunt, realizing he was surrounded, threw his gun down. "Don't shoot! We surrender!" But Caldwell was made of a different kind of evil. He wasn't going to be taken alive. He let out a desperate scream, spun around, and leveled his shotgun directly at Tate. "If I'm going to hell, I'm taking the bastard with me." He pulled the trigger, but Harlan was faster. He threw himself in front of the boy, a human shield. The world erupted in a flash of blinding pain as the shotgun pellets ripped into his side and shoulder. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was Tate's face, his eyes wide with horror. And the last thing he heard was the sound of Jonas, the war chief, screaming his name. Not Harlan, not Pike. He screamed the Ute word for brother. Harlan drifted in a sea of pain and fevered dreams. He saw Miriam's face, smiling. He felt the cold Wyoming wind. He heard voices, some in English, some in the flowing cadence of the Ute tongue. He was floating, untethered from the world. When he finally woke, it was to the smell of herbs and smoke. He wasn't in the dusty sheriff's office. He was in a large teepee, lying on soft furs. The light filtering through the hide was gentle. His shoulder and side were tightly bound with clean bandages. Tate was sitting beside him, grinding herbs in a stone bowl. When he saw Harlan's eyes were open, he put the bowl down. "You're awake," the boy said softly. "Am I dead?" Harlan rasped, his throat dry as dust. Tate almost smiled. "No. The shaman says you are too stubborn to die." Jonas entered the teepee, ducking his head. He was still in his chief's attire. He knelt beside Harlan. His face, usually so grim, was filled with a profound relief. "The world owes you a debt, Harlan Pike," Jonas said, his voice thick with emotion. "You called me brother," Harlan said, the memory hazy. Jonas nodded. "I did." He took a breath, as if the words were heavy. "There is much you do not know. Miriam, she was not just a friend to our people. She was family. My wife was a white woman, an outcast from her own world. Miriam was her sister." Harlan stared, his mind struggling to piece it together. Miriam had a sister? A sister married to a Ute war chief? "Miriam never told you because she wanted to protect you," Jonas continued. "Protect you from men like Caldwell. She had discovered his crimes long before you settled here. She came to this territory specifically to find a way to expose him. She used her inheritance to buy the ranch, to establish a life here, to gather proof." "And me?" Harlan whispered. "Was I just part of her plan?" "No," Jonas said firmly. "You were the part she didn't plan for. She fell in love with you. She thought with you she could build a life after the fight was over. But Caldwell found out she had the proof. The real territorial survey maps that proved his deeds were fraudulent." He looked away, his jaw tight with old pain. He killed her to get them, but he never found them. The pieces were clicking into place, a puzzle of unimaginable grief and courage. And Tate? Harlan asked, his eyes finding the boy. Miriam knew she was in danger, Jonas said. Weeks before she died, she came to us. She was pregnant. She begged us to take the child if anything happened to her, to raise him as one of our own, to keep him safe. Harlan's head was spinning. Pregnant? But the doctor, he said. The town doctor was and is in Caldwell's pocket, Jonas said with contempt. He helped spread the lie. Miriam didn't die in childbirth, Harlan. She gave birth to Tate a week before Caldwell murdered her. She brought him to us, to my wife, in the dead of night. That was the last time we saw her alive. The breath left Harlan's body in a ragged gasp. He looked at Tate, truly looked at him, for the first time. The boy's eyes. They weren't just old river stones. They were Miriam's eyes. The same shape, the same light. He was his son, his living, breathing son. The 7 years of empty, hollow grief hadn't been for one lost life, but for two. And one of them had been alive all along. Tears, hot and cleansing, streamed down Harlan's face. He reached out a trembling hand, and Tate took it. The boy's hand was small, but his grip was strong. Why? Harlan choked out. Why put me through all this? Why the test? Because we had to be sure, Jonas said, his voice gentle. Miriam's plan was to use the maps to bring Caldwell down. When she died, the maps died with her. We believe she hid them on the ranch, but only someone with a right to be there, someone Caldwell wouldn't suspect, could find them. For years we watched you, waiting, but you were lost in your grief. You were a ghost. We had to wake you up. We had to see if Miriam's husband, if my son's father, still had the fire inside him. Tate is your son? Harlan asked, confused. I raised him. He is the son of my heart, Jonas said. But you are the father of his blood. He is of two worlds, and he needed you both. The whole elaborate, dangerous charade, the spyglass on the ridge, the gun, the journal. It was all a desperate attempt to reignite the man Miriam had loved, to forge him into the warrior he needed to be to finish her fight. Caldwell, Hunt? Harlan asked. They are our prisoners, Jonas said grimly. They will face Ute justice. Then we will hand them, and the journal, over to the federal marshals. Their world of lies is over. Harlan lay back, exhausted but whole for the first time in 7 years. The empty room in his heart was filled. The silence that had haunted him was gone, replaced by the quiet sounds of the Ute camp, the whisper of the wind against the teepee, and the steady, warm presence of his son holding his hand. There is one last thing, Jonas said, pulling a small, rolled-up piece of hide from his belt. Tate found this. It was in the lining of that old quilt you wrapped him in. Miriam's quilt. Harlan took the hide. It was a map, not of the territory, but of his ranch. It was a drawing of the porch. There was an X marked over one of the floorboards, right under the swing that hadn't moved in 7 years. Underneath the X was a single word. Hope. The original survey maps. The proof that could give all the cheated men their land back. The key to Miriam's justice. She had hidden it in the one place she knew his grief wouldn't let him go. He looked at Tate, his son, and saw Miriam's legacy. He looked at Jonas, his brother, and saw the strength of family. He had gone into the wilderness a broken man, chasing a ghost, but he had come out a father, a warrior, a man reborn. The story wasn't over. A new one, their story, was just beginning. If you were moved by Harlan's journey to reclaim his life and find his family, hit that like button. And tell us in the comments, what do you think is a more powerful force, grief or justice? We read every comment, and your stories inspire us. And if you want more tales of the hidden corners of history and the human heart, make sure you subscribe and ring that bell so you don't miss a single story. You won't regret it.